OK, let's put some of that, should we, to Chris Philps, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, with us now.
Shadow Home Secretary now.
Oh, I do beg your pardon. Congratulations.
All is forgiven, don't worry.
Oh, how does that feel? That's quite the brief, isn't it?
Well, it's an important job. I mean, holding the government to account on crime, law and order, policing, immigration, there's a lot to talk about.
There certainly is. But let's start, should we, with the US temporarily closing its embassy in Kiev. The opposition's response to that?
Well, obviously that's a decision for the Americans. I think we should be doing everything we possibly can to support Ukraine in this, dark hour. They've been invaded by their neighbour. They have every right to defend themselves, and I think we should do everything to support them. I'm glad that President Biden apparently has given permission to use weapons on Russian territory in self-defence. I mean, any country that is attacked needs to do everything it can to defend itself, and we should support Ukraine to do that.
Do you think we're taking too long to make that decision?
Well, I've always been an advocate of doing more sooner. Quite often, the West has provided sort of weapons systems to Ukraine like a number of months after President Zelensky has asked for them. So I've always been an advocate of doing sort of more sooner. But I'm glad that President Biden has got there now. So,
as far as the UK is concerned, we should be reacting quicker?
Well, I mean, we've obviously done a huge amount over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, should we be allowing our Storm Shadow missiles to be fired into Russia?
Well, I would certainly support doing that because, there are troop concentrations on Russian soil. There are, the supply chains for fuel and that kind of thing obviously run to the front line through Russian territory. And, when a country is attacked, it is perfectly entitled under international law and sort of long-established practice to respond by defending itself and attacking its adversary outside the borders of its own territory, as we've done when we've been attacked in the past. So I think we should be supporting Ukraine to do that, yes.
And how worried should we be about Putin's sabre rattling over nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't think we should be blasé about that. It's a very serious matter to consider. But President Putin has, as you said, made these sort of threats in the past on several occasions, and that is worth keeping in mind.
So he's crying wolf?
Look, I don't want to sort of trivialise it, but, he has made these threats quite a few times before.
OK. Talk to me about the farmers making their voices heard yesterday. You couldn't get up Whitehall. There were so many, tens of thousands of farmers here. Do they have a point?
Oh, they certainly do have a point. And I was out with the farmers and many of my colleagues yesterday as well. The majority of family farms are going to be affected by this farm tax, which Labour are introducing. It's going to mean farms that have been in families for generations are going to be lost. Very often, these are farmers who aren't making very much money. Farming is not a particularly profitable thing to do. These aren't people who are super rich or anything like that. These are regular farmers working incredibly hard, getting up early in the morning.
Assets of £3 million.
Well, I mean, that depends if you add all the allowances together. I mean, the threshold is actually £1 million for the farm itself. And even people with farms worth that much money are not actually making much cash on a year-to-year basis. Farming is a really difficult thing to do.
Rich.
Well, but they're not making much cash, year to year very often. They're on quite low incomes. And, of course, we depend on those farms for our food security and to keep food prices down. If farms start closing, obviously it's terrible for the farmers who have worked for generations on that land, but it's also bad for the rest of us because food prices will go up. And this is a really sort of vindictive policy by the Labour government. It won't raise very much money and it will affect the majority of farms, including quite small farms. So I'm very worried about it, and the government, I think, should change their mind.
Do you acknowledge that it could potentially be more targeted so that foreigners coming in buying big plots of land should have to pay inheritance tax on that?
Yeah, I think if there are examples of essentially what you might call avoidance or abuse, where very wealthy people are using this as a loophole to avoid tax that would ordinarily be payable, I think tightening up on those.
Jeremy Clarkson admitted that in an article in the Times.
So I think tightening up if it's being abused by people who are extremely wealthy to avoid inheritance tax, and I'd be in favour of certainly closing down those loopholes. Absolutely, I'd support that. But that is not what this measure does. It's a blunt instrument that affects the majority of regular farmers.
So you agree with the overall policy, but they haven't thought it through. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, the overall policy is to hit the vast majority of farmers, and I do not agree with that. That's a big mistake. But if there are targeted ways to close off abuse or close off loopholes, that would be a reasonable thing to do. But this is not targeted. It's hitting the vast majority of farmers.
So what do you say to the Secretary of State who suggests that the best thing for farmers to do is for them to take professional tax advice?
Well, I think that's a really heartless and callous thing to say. I mean, these are people who are working really hard, not making very much money, and just to hit them with a tax measure that will end their ability to farm and produce food for all of us and just say, go and get tax advice, I think it's a really just heartless, unempathetic thing to say.
You want to talk to me about non-crime hate incidents. Tell me.
Well, I'm concerned the police are spending too much time on matters that don't meet the criminal threshold and don't even represent behaviour that might rapidly escalate into criminality, because I think we would want the police to concentrate on that. But behaviour which isn't criminal and which is at no imminent risk of becoming criminal, I think is essentially a waste of police time. I think the public would want the police concentrating on the real crimes and the really serious matters. And so I'd like to see the government change the guidance to make that clear. And I'm giving a speech in an hour or two's time to the National Police Chiefs Council and to police and crime commissioners, and I'm going to make that point operationally to them as well. We'd like the police to focus on crime or behaviour that's at imminent risk of becoming criminal, not being the thought police. So
does this relate to social media? I don't quite understand.
Well, it can relate to social media. So there's a Telegraph journalist, Julie Bindel, a different Telegraph journalist, who was spoken to by the police and investigated for some tweets about the trans issue. Now, I think that's a reasonable topic for debate. That's not a police matter. The Times did some reporting last week that identified numerous incidents that were inappropriate, where the police took action and investigated, which included 9-year-old children in a playground just sort of teasing and insulting each other. That's not a police matter. The police should not be spending time on that. They should be spending time on criminality or behaviour that is at immediate risk of becoming criminal.
And what about online safety for youngsters?
Well, that is obviously very important. We've got the Online Safety Act now in...
Finally?
Yeah, well, it passed about a year ago, so what's happening now, Ofcom are drafting all the codes of practice that implement it. I'd like them to get on with that.
It took years.
Implement it. It took a while to get to Parliament. Actually, I was one of the ministers who took it through Parliament. It did take a very long time. But it passed about a year ago, and Ofcom are now, as I say, implementing it. That contains measures to protect children online and to prevent social media firms facilitating criminal activity. And I would like to see tough measures taken by Ofcom against social media firms that don't protect children. But that's for Ofcom. That's not for the police to investigate, offensive tweets or to get involved in playground arguments, which has happened in the recent past.
And some suggestions that adulthood, when it comes to using online devices, should be raised from under 13 to under 16. Do you agree with that?
I think there is some merit to that, because these social media platforms are deliberately designed to be extremely addictive. It's not an accident, it's by design. And I'm concerned that young teenagers are getting addicted to these things. It's very, I think it's quite damaging to those young people and to their lives. I think it can possibly be a contributing factor to the mental health, increase in mental health problems that we've seen in recent years. So that is something I think is worth studying, yeah.
OK, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Sky News has witnessed the relentless toll shoplifting. Let me just ask you about this, shoplifting. You were just about to have your cup of tea, weren't you? Shoplifting. The police are not called often enough when it comes to shoplifting. What would you do about it?
Well, in government, we produced with the police a retail crime action plan, which says the police should always turn up. If an offender has been detained by the store security staff, or indeed the public, they should always turn up where there's been an assault. They should always turn up where that's needed to secure evidence. And the police should always, not sometimes, but always investigate every line of inquiry, particularly CCTV footage, because you can now run that through the facial recognition database and very often get a match to identify the perpetrator. Every single one of those cases, every single one, should be followed up by the police. They've committed to do that, and that is what I think the public and certainly we in Parliament expect, because shoplifting is costing the retail industry £1 billion a year in lost stock, another £1 billion in security measures. It's really hurting the retail sector. Staff are getting assaulted, and the police have to clamp down on it hard. It's not a minor crime, it's a serious crime, and it merits that kind of response.
You can have your tea
Can I have my tea now?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.